Hello and welcome to Third Thursday at Hoover's, and I'm so glad you could join us here this evening. I'm happy to announce we have 7 new public libraries partnering with us to bring you this program. That's 20 public libraries in all on the Third Thursday program. Joining us tonight are Alta Vista, Bondurant, Hamburg, Hiawatha, Keck Memorial in Wapello, LeClaire, and Mondamin Public Libraries. Welcome to you all, and I hope you enjoy tonight's program. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO at the Hoover Presidential Foundation, and we'll begin the program in a few minutes. But first, I have a lot of news to share with you about upcoming events that you may want to participate in. We recently launched a new website called timelessvalues.org. When you visit that site, you'll learn about a major fundraising campaign for the renovation of the Hoover Presidential Library Museum exhibit space. It's been nearly 30 years since the last renovation, and we're so excited to bringing you new technology and other updates to the museum. You'll also learn about a special benefit for Hoover taxpayers who contribute to the Timeless Values campaign and how to earn a 25% Iowa state tax credit, not just a deduction, but a credit on your Iowa taxes for your gift of any size, no matter how much the gift is. The Hoover Presidential Museum is now open Tuesday through Saturdays from 9 to 5 p.m. Time tickets are available online at hoover.archives.gov. And there's a special new temporary exhibit waiting for you now through January 2nd called Leonardo da Vinci, Machines in Motion. The exhibit contains 30 machines that were built after in-depth study of Da Vinci's designs by a group of scientists and skilled craftsmen. There are life-sized and mostly are fully operational. In fact, I tried a few out myself last week. The fun part is you can touch and set them in motion yourselves while learning about the items. This exhibit is perfect for engineers, tinkerers, mechanics, and families with children. Virtually anybody will enjoy this. In addition to that, today we completed our move into our new foundation office building at 127 West Main Street in West Branch. Our new space is large enough for a small exhibit, so beginning December 3rd, we invite you to come see a festival of trees. Many of you that have been to the library previously in December remember the Christmas tree exhibit in the library, and since they don't have space to do that with the Da Vinci Machines in Motion exhibit, we're hosting that Festival of Trees with 12 Days of Christmas at our building. The exhibit will be open 7 days a week through the holidays. We hope you'll come and visit and check out the trees in our new office space. You can learn more about it on our website, hooverpresidentialfoundation.org, under the News and Events tab, then the calendar of events. As for tonight's program, we invite you to enter questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone else has entered if you'd also like to hear those answered. As we may not have time to answer all the questions provided, top vote getters will be asked first. Tonight's presentation is called The Tale of Two Famines. Our speaker is Robert Zapesochny, a researcher and writer who has appeared in a range of publications, including Newsmax, The Washington Times, and The American Conservative. And when he's not writing, Robert works for a medical research company in Rochester, New York. And as we were chatting beforehand, is quite a wrestling fan and would love to meet Dan Gable and come to a Hawkeye wrestling meet. So I'm going to call out to all our listeners. If you got a couple extra tickets, let me know. We want to get Robert. We'd love to have Robert come to Iowa City and see that. So yes, Robert will lead us through the role Herbert Hoover played during the Russian famines of 1921 to 23, and again in 32 and 33, from the perspective of his grandparents who experienced it and were fed by Hoover. Robert, we're really looking forward to hearing your story tonight.
Well, I thank you. And I just want to say, when I was 15 years old, I was just amazed by the story of Gable and how nobody scored on him in the Olympics. And then to be 24 years old and be sitting with my dad and telling him the story about, because he told me lots of stories throughout his life, but I realized when you get into your 20s, then that's when the really nasty stuff begins. And we were just sitting on our kitchen table. I was 24, so this was 2006. And he said, your grandfather. I was reading his memoirs. Like, wait, you never told me he had a memoir. And after that, it was like, well, can we read through it? And he guards it even to this day because it's really the only. It's a very detailed account of his early life. And so he's like, look, I'll read it to you, but you have to understand it's so unbelievable. You have to let me sort of sit down and explain to you and just wait a couple times. So my twin brother and I that weekend, we just sat down and he sort of read through the story of the famine. But it's important to understand, I'm here as a thank you to Hoover because I wouldn't be here if not for Herbert Hoover. My parents all the descendants of my grandparents would not be here if not for this one man. And this is my way this is the closest way I'll be able to say thank you to him. But I think before you begin to understand how hopeless the situation was, it's important to understand that before you understand just how much the famine helped. So in 1920, my grandfather was 13 years old, and his father and him were just talking one day, and it was during a series of pogroms. So during the Russian Revolution, there was just war all over Russia. And one of the reasons that led to the famine in the first place was, one, a lot of people were in military arms and fighting either on the Reds or the Whites or even just in gangs. The fact is that by 1920, the country had gone through what was called war communism. That is, even when the communists took over a certain area, they weren't really being paid for their agriculture. They weren't being paid as farmers very well, so they didn't work as hard anyway. So you didn't have a lot of people, they didn't work hard. And even if they did, there was a huge drought. Now, Russia and Ukraine had huge series of droughts. And actually, in preparation for this, I tried to look through some academic articles, which are really some great ones on the 21 to 23 famine. So even though there was enormous drought, for example, in 1869 and 1885, even worse than the one in 21, the fact is that certain areas of Ukraine, they just basically war communism meant that Lenin would literally take the grain from these farmers, kill them if they resisted, and send them to his people. So that was one of many factors: the Russian Revolution, enormous drought, mismanagement, a chaotic situation. So in October of 1920, Russia had fought many wars, obviously the Russian Civil War, but the Soviets had fought a war with Poland that ultimately Poland was able to rescue its independence. Obviously, as people might know, Poland was part of the Russian Empire from 1795. From 1795 pretty much until 1918, it was carved up among Austria, Russia, and Prussia, and then of course, from 1918 to 39, they were free, and then they were taken over once again by the Nazis and then the Soviets, and they weren't free from 89. So for almost 200 years, with the exception of that 21-year period, they were free. And Poland had, even though they had fought in the summer of 1920 and defended Warsaw, they had decided to see, and they were negotiating a treaty with Russia, which eventually they signed in early 21 in Riga, which ultimately lined up the border between Russia and Poland. But where my grandfather was living was in Belarus, called a village called Zapesochny, which is actually, my name is Zapesochny. Zapesochny means behind the sand. So Za is behind, Pesok is the sand. And it's in the Pripyat River, which is actually, sadly, about 100 miles from Chernobyl, which is obviously in Ukraine. So I've never been to this part of Belarus, but the village still exists. It's still it's still a suburb of Turov. But when my grandfather, when he was 13 years old and he was taken, he saw that there was this pogrom in the village. He was with his father and this anti-Semite, one of the leaders of this Polish band. So it wasn't so much the Polish military, but it was a faction that was loyal to the military, led by a general named Stanislav Bulach-Bolachowicz. And the followers of him launched several raids into Belarus in 1920, including the one that damaged their village. And one of the men broke into my grandfather's house, and he shot my great-grandfather and literally pointed the gun at him. And for some reason, as anti-Semitic or as he might have been, he decided not to do something, even though a lot of Jews were killed in pogroms because they were sort of associated with the Bolshevik Revolution. But anyway, he left, and then my grandfather had to tell his mother, my great-grandmother, and his siblings what had just happened. And so they had to flee into the forest for a couple of months. Eventually, they managed, my grandfather's oldest brother, Yudel, he was living in Kiev, and he was 17 years older. So he had already begun, he had a successful shoemaking business in Kiev, and he got my grandfather, a job in Kiev. So in February of 1921, just as the famine was beginning, they really lost their breadwinner. My grandfather had to work, his siblings had to work, but it was a somewhat manageable situation. And then, of course, the famine hit. And he says many times that, it's one thing, to have a job, you can find a job and you can go to school without food. And literally people were dying. Something like 5 million people ultimately died in this famine. And of course, as I'm sure many people here know, Hoover was able to eventually negotiate with Lenin's people. And I actually found an interesting academic article which said that Lenin, even as these people were coming in, even as these people were trying to help these people, Lenin wrote to Vyacheslav Molotov that, if I remember the exact quote, actually looking at right in front of me. I'm trying to see if I somehow I'm not. Oh, it is. Oh, here it is. In the view of the agreement with the American Hoover, we can expect the arrival of a lot of Americans. We must take care of surveillance and intelligence. The main thing is to identify and mobilize the maximum number of communists who know English to introduce them into the Hoover Commission. This is from Richard Pipe's book, The Unknown Lenin. So you get the impression that even as these people are trying to help these people, and Lenin in 1921, he realized that war communism wasn't going to work, and he had this new economic policy, which my grandfather's brother was a part of. He was a NAP guy, and he actually got a business, and slowly the economy was changing, so that by obviously 1922, thankfully, with the help of the American Relief Administration bringing food, every one of my family, my grandfather and his siblings and his mother, they were able to survive the famine, despite the fact that 5 million people did. I think at the height of it, obviously over 20 million people were fed. Of course, I'm sure many of you know this. And I was, certainly shocked to think about how much of a difference he had made. And the reason why I call this a tale of two famines is that people need to understand what would have happened if Herbert Hoover had not been there. And I think the 1932-33 famine is important to understand at the same time as the 21-23 famine, because it allows people to give an idea of what would have been, because it was just, within 10 years. And in some ways, it gives you an idea of just how desperately the world needs America. They need its courage. They need its, not only its financial resources, but the good nature of the American people. And so in 32 and 33, this is actually called, in Ukrainian, it's called Holodomor. The Russian word for hungry is golodny. And obviously a lot of G's kind of translate to H's. So Ukrainian and Russian are somewhat similar languages. I can usually understand about half of what they're saying, but usually anything G is with H. So the Russian word for mountain is gore, and in Ukrainian it's like khore. So it's kind of an interesting way the language works. And of course, in Russia now, one of the provinces taken over by Ukraine, one of them is Lugansk, and of course the Ukrainians call it Luhansk. So it's kind of an interesting way. But anyway, in 32-33, roughly 10 million people died, approximately 7 million in Ukraine, another 2 million in Kazakhstan, and another 1 million in the Volga region of Russia, which incidentally was a problematic region in the 1921 and 23 famine. My experience is mostly with my family in Ukraine, but obviously it affected other parts of the Russian Empire. Anyway, much like both of these famines, it's important to understand were effectively man-made. It was communism that did this. So The USSR, obviously, and even Russia itself, obviously in recent decades, it's been known as an oil-driven economy. That is, oil was very much a part, oil and natural gas were roughly 2/3 of their exports. But long before oil and gas, and really before World War II, I don't think oil was ever more than 18% of the Soviet Union's exports. From 1895 to 1914, grain represented 50 to 70% of its export earnings. Therefore, the way that the Russians were going to industrialize their country, even as late as 1930, Russia, the Soviet Union, approximately only 20% of people lived in urban areas, and of course the other 80% in rural areas. So this was their way of selling this grain, was very important for them to get the money to industrialize their country. The problem was, what happens when there's a drought? And Stalin basically did not care that officially if you look at it as early as 1913, which was a great record of, between 1913 and 1921, the grain dropped by upwards of, well, actually about more than half. And then obviously it slowly began to creep up again around 28. But then, of course, unfortunately, grain between 1929 and 1933, it dropped again by about 60%. Now, again, most of the grain was distributed throughout the country to feed the people and the livestock. But around roughly 5 million was designed to be sent abroad to be sold in the market. And obviously to get that money, and then they could pay for their industrialization and largely other economic matters, including their military. Now, unfortunately, what happened was in 1932, the situation was terrible, and Stalin felt, well, wait a second, you're saying that the production's going down? Well, unfortunately for them, Stalin basically said, no, we're going to take this food from you, and we're going to take the food from the farmers. Now, even some of the people in Stalin's own inner circle were saying, you can't do this. I mean, there'll be a revolt. This is a peasant country. And primarily the two main ones were Nikolai Bukharin, who was the ideologist and a member of the Politburo, and another guy named Rykov, who was the prime minister of Russia at the time. Both of these men, a few years later, were executed during the purges for basically having the temerity to say anything to Stalin. But what's important is that as early as 1917, Stalin, who was commissar of the nationalities, actually wrote an essay, Marxism and the National Colonial Question. He wrote, there are cases when this is his quote, there are cases when the right of self-determination conflicts with another, a higher right, the right of the working classes come to power to consolidate power. In such cases, this must be said bluntly. The right of self-determination cannot and must not serve as an obstacle to the working class in exercising its rights to dictatorship. So basically, it was his way of saying, we're going to do whatever we have to do. And the problem was that Lenin himself, as early as 1917, he talked about the idea of how the farmer, he talked about sort of the stupidity of rural life. He sort of argued that the farmer was, quote, far from being instinctive or traditional collectivist, is in fact fiercely and meanly individualistic, close quote. So Stalin and Lenin sort of saw farmers, those who could feed themselves, as naturally capitalists or naturally people who were a threat to the regime. So this was sort of a twofold man-made famine. They wanted to take the grain from these people, and if they died, the idea was the people that were kulaks or people who were most likely opponents of the regime would likely die as a result. So who cares? Now, for my grandfather, he actually said in his memoir, "Я всегда был голодный," meaning I was always hungry, and so was most people. I mean, he actually, in his diary, he talked about the rations. That is, if you worked in an industrial plant, you had this much. If you worked in if you had a leisurely job, like an office job, you could have, so your rations were pretty minimal. And again, it shocks me to this day that so many of them survived, because in this case, like I said, 10 million died, 7 million specifically in Ukraine. Now, 3.5 million died directly from hunger. But even if the famine and starvation didn't kill you, a lot of them died from preventable diseases. As you can imagine, people who are starving and barely surviving, they're more vulnerable to things like tuberculosis, for example, and those things went up. So that's why historians have some ranges about what's been going on and how people died. And obviously some people were just, they didn't die from hunger. These were farmers who were just shot or arrested on site for the temerity of trying to keep their own food from them. So Stalin and my grandfather, not only survived these two famines, understanding a few important points. His father was one of the oldest of 6 children, and yet he was the first to die because obviously he was the one who didn't leave Russia. And I think it certainly served his moment of thinking, something like this is always going to happen in Russia. If not a famine, it's always going to be something if we don't leave or if I don't take the opportunity. And he kind of regretted because his brother, my grandfather was one of 6 children. The oldest was Udall, who lived pretty much until Chernobyl got him. But the only other brother who left Russia was a guy named Misha, and he actually was going to go to Palestine. And then he ended up he got on the wrong boat and ended up in Argentina all of a sudden, which is kind of a funny story in itself. But anyway, my grandfather, towards the decades, after a couple of years went by, and then he was arrested, like many people were in the 30s, and was sent to Vorkuta, where he met my grandmother. His first wife, he had a first wife, and he had a son. And then in 1936, he was arrested because he was, like a lot of people, they had to arrest people. It was a hysteria. He was Jewish, so he was seen as a Trotsky sympathizer. So eventually he would never see his first wife, or very rarely for like 10 years after that. And certainly he had to divorce her because once you're arrested, you're sort of seen as an enemy of the state. And then he went to Vorkuta, he met my grandmother, and he had my uncle and my father. And the way the famine affected him was once my father and my uncle were around his age, he realized more than everything that, what would have happened in 1920 if his father and his family could have left earlier. And, this was also around the time when Israel had just won the '67 war, and there was finally real Jewish immigration to Russia was a real possibility. So in the 70s, really from 67 to 88, something like 250,000 Jews were able to leave Russia, thankfully. And my grandfather wanted to be one of them, and he wanted all of his family to go. And incidentally, one of his brothers, his youngest brother, whose name was Sasha, he actually had a great job in Izhevsk working for the Kalashnikov plant. And they almost got into a fight because he was telling his nieces, my great uncle's daughters, you got to leave this country. Everyone has to leave. And he's like, I got a great job. If they leave, then I lose my job. So imagine 2 septuagenarians about to get into a fight about something, but they got over it. And in 1978, my father got to go, and my parents and my older brother left Russia forever. And my grandfather, on the one that I've been talking about, and my grandmother, they left Russia around the same time, and they met in Vienna and they went to Italy. But my grandparents wanted to go to Israel, and they, thankfully, toward the end of his life, he got to see almost every one of his relatives, at least the ones that were still alive. The ones who wanted to leave eventually ended up in either Israel or the United States. I, of course, got to meet a lot of these relatives over the years. And it sort of hit me that each and every one of these people are alive today solely because of one man. And it's Herbert Hoover, but of course, all the roughly 300 ARA people Americans who worked in Russia. Obviously, some of this was funded through private investors, and some of it through the US government. And it was extraordinary to think, the more and more I learn about this, the more I'm angry to find out that in 1959, for example, when Khrushchev came to America, I was shocked to find out that, yes, he talked about, oh, it's kind of interesting that the American Relief Administration, yes, they helped out, but at the same time, they were involved in the Civil War. Yes, there were some Americans who fought in the Russian Civil War, and there was Allied intervention, but, so what? I mean, the fact is they fed 20 million people a day. That's a lot more than Khrushchev ever could. And you just realize that, these things happen because of communism primarily. Really toward even in the good times of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, I was reading a report that as much as 20% of their working age population actually worked in agriculture. So why is it that 20% of your people in our country, it's about 2% work in agriculture, and we feed our people just fine, and we can feed people across the world. If anything, we can do great even with even less. These people had 20% of their population, and they still couldn't feed their people. They actually had to import grain. Now, interestingly enough, about 3% of their population, as late as 79, of their farmers were involved in these semi-private farms, and they were producing something like 25 to 30% of potatoes and other agricultural products. And it was like, wow, so it just shows you what incentives capitalism is over communism. And, my grandfather, in 1992, as he reflected on not only the famine, but very much of his life, he sort of thought to himself, everyone that I love is, if they're not, they haven't passed away, they're certainly in America or Israel. But also, I think, thankfully, he got to see the Soviet Union collapse, which is actually about 30 years ago. Next month will be 30 years when the Soviet collapse occurred. And I hope that what this story tells people is that people who have to live through such a horrible ordeal, not once, but twice, but really, those were the worst times. Obviously going to the Gulag was also terrible, and just living through the Soviet experience. But I always was taught to believe, and my dad always tells me, every night he wakes up, every night he goes to sleep, and every day he wakes up, he thanks God he's in America. I know right now it's not really fashionable, or by some people, and there are many people who want to focus on everything that's bad about the country. But I'm very grateful to live in this country. I've met people, so many people, my relatives, but also not only my relatives, but like a lot of immigrant communities, I got a chance to, usually my parents and my grandparents, they had other immigrants, and, not a month would go by, we wouldn't, go to parties at each other's houses, or there'd be birthdays or anniversaries or weddings. And the important thing is, by being around all these people, I realized, they're grateful to be here. And, when I saw just recently with so many Afghans running to those airplanes, trying to leave the country as the Taliban is taking over, there's so much about this country that, yes, we have to fix. And every country has problems, but I would take our problems over any others. And I hope that whatever else is said about this, these things don't happen in the United States. That's why you need people, witnesses. And sometimes I can imagine how unbelievable some of this can be. I've tried my best to sort of talk about this, in part because, one, a lot of people either don't remember this stuff, or now it's just, it's fading into history. And I hope that people will understand that not only do these events occur, but because, interestingly enough, one of the reasons why the 1932 famine wasn't really told about was because, you had people like the New York Times, Walter Duranty who was a media guy there, and he was actually, talk about Russian collusion and fake news. This guy was actually blocking and saying, no, there was no famine. Well, actually, yes, there was. And you had good journalists like Garrett Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge who were able to say, no, in fact, there was a Soviet famine. And these things occur in these types of countries because that's what killers do. One of the worst cliches about communism is it's a nice system that doesn't work. But it's actually, no, it's an evil system that always works the same way. Lots and lots of people die. and they take power. And, if you lose your freedom, it's very difficult for us to get it back. And, obviously Russia is going through some rough times right now. And last time I was there was 2016, but I come away, I would like to end with one little story. I was there in 2016, and I remember thinking about all four of my grandparents and how they had to live through this society. And there were these old communists walking by with pictures of Lenin and Stalin. And this was in Red Square, of all places. And I said in Russian, hey, comrades, did you forget how many people Stalin killed? And, one of them looked at me with this really weird look. And he actually weirdly looked like Lenin, surprisingly. I don't know if he was an actor or something. But, and I thought to myself, there was a guard nearby. And, in my, 30 years ago, I would have been arrested for something like that. So, the world can change with the right people. And Herbert Hoover was one of them. And, we always think about, is a life well lived? And I think his life was well lived. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to thank him personally. And, there's dozens and dozens of people who I love the most who would not be here if not for him. So thank you, Mr. President. And I hope that history will treat you kinder by understanding that you should be treated. And I hope that the days of judging President Hoover on anything less than his entire career will come to a close. Thank you.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for that presentation, and especially the close link that you had, your family has with Herbert Hoover. So we've got time for a few questions. I've got a couple of questions already. So if anybody has a question, be sure and type it in on the Q&A feature on this presentation, and we'll ask that on there. Well, Robert, the first question I've got is from Bruce, and he says, Hoover was Secretary of Commerce from 1921 to 1929. Did he meet with Lenin and work on Russian famine relief while he was a USA government official?
It's actually very interesting. I've never found that in my research. I would find it very difficult to believe that he did, but that's a matter of public record. I'm sure I could find it out for him. I'm very sorry. I never bothered to look that one up. And certainly in any of the academic research, there's no record of any meetings. Interestingly enough, he did meet Hitler once. Which is strange, but yeah, never Stalin.
Okay, very good. Another question is, well, with your grandfather obviously really suffered through on it. Did he ever mention to you or the story as far as maybe what his lowest point was during the famine?
Oh, sure.
On there.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Well, I mean, actually, I was trying to think. Obviously, seeing his father killed. I mean, that was probably the worst part of it. And then, he was not a man. He died when I was 11. So, and yes, he still actually, it's funny. When I was 8 years old, he had this video for like an hour where I have an older brother who's 10 years older than me. And he was literally taking him for like an hour. And I still have this VHS tape somewhere. I converted it to DVD, where he does talk about, losing his family. And just, that was by far the worst part of it.
Okay. Very good. It's interesting. So again, you came, were you born in the United States, or did you come from Russia?
My twin brother and I were the first to be born in America. And we were born in 1981. My parents, they left Russia in late 78, and they stayed in Italy, which was kind of the Casablanca for Soviet refugees. And then they came to America in 1979. Okay,
very good. Maybe if you could just tell a little bit about yourself and how you got into writing and your study so far.
Okay, sure. Well, like a lot of people, I went, like a lot of political writers. I was always very interested in politics, and certainly when the Cold War was happening, I got to see people. My father was very interested in getting his brother out of Russia. So that was sort of my first experience in politics. And not only was he trying to get his brother out, but a lot of his Russian relatives were trying to get other people out. So I got to see the cause very early on. And then In terms of my writing, when I was in college, I went to CPAC, which is the Conservative Political Action Committee in Washington. Oh, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, but every year it's kind of like the who's who of college Republicans. They go to this, and conservatives, and they go to this meeting, and you get to meet all sorts of conservative speakers. And one of them I met was a guy named Peter Hannaford, who worked for President Reagan. He was the Deaver Hannaford. So they were the ones who worked in Reagan's gubernatorial camp. Well, they worked in the gubernatorial office and the gubernatorial campaigns, and then later for president. And he was a big writer, and he became a friend of mine. And one time, after he'd introduced me to some interesting people in Washington, I said, well, if I'd love to help you if I can, because you've been done so much for me, and I want to do something for you to show you just what it's my way of giving back to you. And he was writing a book about presidential retreats, including President Hoover. And I did some research for him on some of the presidents in the 19th century, and he liked it so much. So we ended up doing 4 books together in research. And then he had an article in the American Spectator. So we did some joint articles. And after he died, I took over the column and did a lot of writing there. I did that for about a year, and then I got into a bit of an argument with one of the editors, which happens. It's just a difference of nothing personal, just a difference of style and opinion, and a lot of competition. So I left the Spectator in 2018, and then for about a year, I sort of just did my work. And then obviously when the pandemic hit, I had another friend of mine who got me back into Newsmax and said, you could write for these people. I'm sure they like your stuff. And I've been writing for them since May of 2020.
Great. Oh, another question we have, Robert, was obviously when the Russian famine hit in the early 20s on there, and of course Hoover recognized that irregardless of and Hoover had a real disdain for communism, but the people were starving; they needed to be fed on there. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that he really, I think he tried to negotiate, or at least have some parameters as far as to try and affect some change with the Russians, whether it was releasing prisoners or so forth like that. Do you have any information or things that you've seen on that?
Well, I mean, in terms of cooperation, I think that both Lenin was desperate. The country was in collapse. But Lenin was smart enough to understand that he preyed on the kindness and generosity of Hoover not to extract enormous concessions from him. So, for example, when Emma Goldman tried to meet with Maxim Gorky and other people tried to get people out of these prisoners, they were just like, no, we're not doing it. And so they had all the cards. They knew how to negotiate well. And we were just, and even to my grandfather's point, I mean, he was just shocked that people would just go out of their way to go across a big ocean to meet with people who said all sorts of crazy propaganda about them all the time. I mean, and it's like, how do these people, they hate them, and yet, you hear all this negative stuff about America all the time in Soviet Russia, and yet they're here and they're helping us. So it's an extraordinary tale of generosity, and they didn't know what to make of it. So when Lenin said the quote, that they're spies, he kind of meant it because it was just part of his nature. I mean, that's what he would have done. That's the only reason he would help someone, is to establish a spy network. To tear others down, to try and build yourself or your program up on that. Absolutely. Yes. Okay, great. Well, do you have any other questions from the audience? So we got time for maybe just another question or two on there. So, well, Robert, what as far as for writing going ahead, do you have any special plans or special projects? I would love to write. I have an editor from a book previously. I'd love to write about more free market solutions to how to deal with climate change and rebuilding the Republican Party from the disasters of recent years, trying to make America more free. The other thing, in terms of my columns, I'm very much interested right now writing a column on inflation, and certainly, but the main issue is how do we fight and keep the rise of China, and obviously trying to restore and reverse the growth of government at home.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, that's basically about all the time we have for questions right now. And of course, I'd like to thank Robert for sharing his family history with us tonight and for an excellent presentation. And I'd also like to thank the Herbert Hoover Library Museum and the National Historic Site and all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. And of course, I'd encourage you all to come visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings. It's a great place to bring your out-of-town guests over the holidays. Remember, the Presidential Library is now open Tuesday through Saturdays from 9 to 5 p.m. with time ticketing. Don't miss the Da Vinci Machines in Motion exhibit, which will be here through January 2nd. And of course, the National Historic Site here in West Branch and the Historic Buildings and Visitor Center are also open for you to enjoy and explore. And don't forget to join us next Thursday, December 16th at 6 p.m. for another interesting third Thursday program. We're really looking at one that we're putting together with a Christmas event. So I'm sure you'll like it and enjoy it. So the Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus and museum renovation. And you can learn more about that and even show your support at timelessvaluescampaign.org. And of course, Robert, again, I'd like to thank you so much on there. And hopefully we can get you out to Iowa sooner rather than later. I'd love to have you come.
Absolutely. I'd love to come. And I hope to, again, I'd like to see, hopefully I can mix it up with the Hawkeyes and see some wrestling. And, obviously I'm very excited to be able to not only see Iowa, but, also I've noticed that if there was any volume issues, I apologize in advance, but actually apologize just in general respect, but thank you. It was just a wonderful time. And I'm glad I got a chance to say my piece.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Robert. And on behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank everyone for joining us tonight with Robert and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus. Thank you very much and have a great evening.